Amsterdam, January 1783. The Bank of Amsterdam held 4.4 million florins in unencumbered coins. The reserve ratio had collapsed to 28%. Just 4 years earlier, in 1779, that ratio stood at 97%. 17 million florins under receipt vanished between March 1780 and January 1783. People who had trusted the bank's promises for 100 consecutive years abandoned the system in 33 months. That was how long it took for the world as first modern reserve currency to begin its terminal collapse. But some currencies survived. Not by printing more paper, not by promising reforms, by following a 7-stage pattern that destroyed the Dutch guilder in 1795, that destroyed the British pound by 1971, and that is destroying the United States dollar right now. This was not random. This was stage 5 of a 7-stage pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in modern financial history. The Dutch guilder followed it from 1780 to 1795. The British pound followed it from 1931 to 1971. And now the United States dollar is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage, crisis by crisis. When reserve ratio drops below 50%, the currency enters the death spiral. When debt exceeds 100% of economic output, the collapse becomes irreversible. The Dutch reached that threshold in 1783. The British reached it in 1945. The United States reached 99% debt to GDP in 2024, according to the Congressional Budget Office. We are not in stage 3. We are in stage 5, 2 stages from total loss of reserve currency status. Before I show you the 7 stages, you need to understand why reserve currency status matters more than military power. Most people think reserve currencies dominate because their countries are strongest. But that only works when the mathematics support the claim. What actually survives every currency collapse is the ratio between claims and backing. Paper survives when metal backs it at ratios above 90%. Paper dies when backing falls below 40%. The Dutch proved it from 1780 to 1795. The British proved it from 1931 to 1971. The Americans are proving it right now. The mathematics are identical. The outcomes are certain. Stage 1 is reserve abundance. The currency becomes reserve status because the issuing country holds massive backing ratios and runs trade surpluses. The Dutch guilder, from 1609 to 1780, maintained backing ratios between 87% and 97%, according to academic research published in the International Journal of Central Banking. For 171 years, the Bank of Amsterdam kept 1 florin in metal for nearly every florin in paper. Foreign merchants deposited trade coins worth 17 million florins by March 1780. The receipt system had rolled over continuously for a century. The guilder became the world's first modern reserve currency through mathematics. The backing ratio created trust. Trust created demand. The British pound entered stage 1 differently. Britain defeated the Dutch in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War from December 1780 to May 1784. By the classical gold standard period from 1880 to 1914, the pound was the anchor of world finance with a fixed exchange rate of $487 per pound. More than 60% of global trade was financed in sterling according to historical records. The Bank of England maintained credibility through strict gold standard discipline. The mathematics worked. The pound dominated global finance for over a century. The United States dollar entered stage 1 at Bretton Woods in July 1944. Representatives from 44 nations agreed the dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. The United States held approximately 70% of global monetary gold reserves according to Federal Reserve history. The U.S. economy represented roughly 50% of world economic output in the late 1940s. For the first decade, demand for American goods and dollars remained high. The dollar was gold in paper form. Stage 2 is abundance turns to adequacy. The reserve ratio remains above 70%, but warning signs emerge. The Dutch entered stage 2 around 1770. The Bank of Amsterdam began lending larger sums to the Dutch East India Company. This seemed reasonable. The company was the most profitable enterprise in the world, but the practice violated the core principle. The bank was creating more claims on metal than metal existed to back those claims. The reserve ratio started declining slowly. Nobody was paying attention. Britain entered stage 2 after World War I. The war had been catastrophically expensive. In 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard through the British Gold Standard Act. This decision overvalued the pound significantly. British exports became uncompetitive. Gold reserves came under pressure. The pound was still a reserve currency, but the mathematics had shifted. The system was stable but fragile. The United States entered stage 2 in the 1960s. The heyday of Bretton Woods lasted only from 1959 through 1968, just 9 years. U.S. dollars flowed out to pay for imports and military spending. In 1960, economist Robert Triffin warned that U.S. did not have enough gold to cover the volume of dollars in worldwide circulation at $35 per ounce. The reserve ratio was declining. The system was doomed. Stage 3 is crisis intervention. The reserve ratio falls below 50%. The Dutch entered Stage 3 when the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War began in December 1780. The Dutch Navy had only 17 ships compared to Britain's 122. Trade collapsed. The company could not repay debts to the Bank of Amsterdam. Receipt holders began a run. The stock of encumbered coin fell from 17 million florins in March 1780 to just 300,000 florins by January 1783. In the first half of 1783, the bank sold 3.5 million florins worth of silver, trying to stabilize the system. By summer 1783, the reserve ratio hit 28%. 4 years earlier, it was 97%. The intervention failed. Britain entered Stage 3 on September 21, 1931. The Great Depression devastated the economy. Speculators attacked the pound. Britain borrowed at least 50 million pounds in gold from the Bank of France and Federal Reserve. Total gold outflows reached 80 to 100 million pounds. The Bank of England should have contracted money supply. Instead, it kept expanding because authorities feared harming the economy. On September 21, 1931, Britain left the gold standard. The intervention failed. The pound began its long descent. The United States entered Stage 3 in 1971. By early 1971, U.S. gold reserves had fallen to critical levels. In May 1971, Germany and Netherlands floated their currencies. On August 11th, Britain requested $3 billion in gold be moved from Fort Knox. On August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced suspension of dollar convertibility to gold, the Nixon shock. The Bretton Woods system effectively died overnight. The dollar remained dominant, but the mathematics had fundamentally changed. The reserve currency was no longer backed by gold. Stage 4 is managed decline. The reserve ratio falls below 30%. The Dutch entered Stage 4 from 1784 to 1789. The Bank of Amsterdam was policy insolvent by 1784. The company's total debt reached 91 million florins by 1790, with 81 million in arrears. Recapitalization attempts failed. In 1790, the premium on bank money disappeared. By end of 1790, the bank declared itself insolvent. The guilder was a walking corpse. Britain entered Stage 4 after leaving gold in 1931. Share of foreign exchange and total global reserves fell from 36% in 1929, 1930 to just 8% in 1932, according to League of Nations data. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound 30% to $2.80. Two world wars and the Great Depression had caused enormous damage. Sterling continued as reserve currency only because no alternative existed besides the dollar. The United States entered Stage 4 in 1973. After Nixon's shock, the Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 established new exchange rates. The rates lasted 15 months. In March 1973, major currencies began floating against the dollar. Bretton Woods was formally dead. The dollar remained a reserve currency through momentum. Global trade was denominated in dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. No alternative existed. As long as America remained dominant, the dollar remained dominant. Stage 5 is accelerating erosion. The reserve share falls below 60%. The Dutch entered Stage 5 from 1790 to 1795. After declaring insolvency in 1790, the guilder lost all reserve function. France invaded in 1795. The Bank of Amsterdam was liquidated in 1819. Total collapse took 15 years from 1780 to 1795. Britain entered Stage 5 from 1967 to 1971. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. Britain continued propping up the pound against market forces. In 1976, Britain called in the International Monetary Fund. By 1971, sterling had lost its role as major reserve currency. From peak status in the 1920s to irrelevance took 50 years. The United States entered Stage 5 in 2024. The dollar's share of allocated reserves fell to 57.8% at end of 2024, according to International Monetary Fund data. This is the lowest since 1994. In Q1 2015, the share was 66%. Over 10 years, the dollar's share dropped 8.6 percentage points. If this pace continues, the dollar falls below 50% by 2034. Central banks are diversifying into non-traditional currencies. 88% of global foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar in 2022, but the trajectory is unmistakable. We are in Stage 5. Accelerating erosion has begun. Stage 6 is crisis of confidence. Debt-to-GDP exceeds 100%. The Dutch reached Stage 6 between 1790 and 1791. The debt crisis bankrupted the state. By 1795, France conquered the Republic. The reserve currency was dead. Britain reached Stage 6 between 1945 and 1949. World War II devastated the economy. In 1949, Britain devalued 30%. The pound survived as reserve currency, but in dramatically reduced form. Only American support saved it temporarily. The United States will reach stage 6 between 2025 and 2034. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt rising from 99% of GDP in 2024 to 116% in 2034. The deficit was $1.8 trillion, or 6.3% of GDP in fiscal 2024. Net interest costs grew to $882 billion in 2024. This exceeds defense spending. Interest costs will exceed $1 trillion annually starting in 2029. The deficit in 2024 was 6.7% of GDP, despite unemployment averaging only 4.0%. Historically, deficits average 2.4% when unemployment is low. The United States is running wartime deficits in peacetime. The mathematics are unsustainable. Stage 6 is beginning. Stage 7 is displacement. A new reserve currency emerges. The Dutch reached stage 7 in 1795 when France conquered the Republic. The British pound sterling became the dominant global reserve currency. The displacement took 20 years from 1780 to 1800. Britain reached stage 7 between 1944 and 1971. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar officially replaced the pound. The pound went from over 60% of global trade settlement before 1931 to under 5% of official reserves by the 2000s. The displacement took 40 years from 1931 to 1971. The United States will reach stage 7 between 2034 and 2050. No single currency can replace the dollar currently. The euro accounts for 20% of reserves. The Chinese renminbi accounts for 2%. But the decline from 66% in 2015 to 57.8% in 2024 occurred through diversification into multiple currencies. By 2034, if current trends continue, the dollar falls below 50% of global reserves. Once below 50%, network effects reverse. The cascade accelerates. Between 2034 and 2050, the dollar will likely lose reserve status completely. The United States' debt to GDP is projected to reach 166% by 2054. Some scenarios project 200%. No reserve currency has survived debt above 150% of GDP for longer than one generation. The mathematics do not allow it. These 7 stages are not predictions. They are mechanisms that operate in every reserve currency collapse. The Dutch guilder from 1780 to 1795. The British pound from 1931 to 1971. The American dollar from 1971 to 2050. When backing ratio falls below 40%, confidence evaporates. When debt exceeds 100% of GDP, the spiral becomes irreversible. When reserve share falls below 50%, network effects flip from positive to negative. This has happened twice before. The current situation will follow the same pattern. The timeline suggests the dollar will lose majority reserve status by 2034. Between 2034 and 2045, the dollar will lose reserve status completely. By 2050, a new system will have emerged. The Dutch took 15 years to collapse. The British took 40 years. The Americans will likely take 30 to 40 years, measured from 1991, when the dollar previously fell below 50%. We are 34 years into that cycle as of 2025. We are in stage 5. We have 2 stages remaining. The 7-stage pattern has destroyed 2 reserve currencies in 250 years. The Dutch guilder from 1780 to 1795, the British pound from 1931 to 1971. Each time the dominant power believed they were different. The Dutch thought their banking innovation made them immune. The British thought their empire made them immune. They were wrong. All of them. The United States dollar is in stage 5 of 7. The drop from 66% in 2015 to 57.8% in 2024 was not a temporary fluctuation. This was the acceleration phase, playing out exactly as it did twice before. The timeline says we have between 9 and 20 years before stage 7, not eliminated, but no longer the reserve currency. And when that happens, interest rates explode. The government cannot borrow to fund deficits. Money creation accelerates, inflation becomes permanent, and Americans' purchasing power collapses by 50 to 70%. This is not pessimism, this is pattern recognition. And the pattern is screaming that the United States dollar is following the exact same 7-stage collapse that destroyed every reserve currency before it. If this showed you that reserve currency status follows mathematical patterns, not political power, if you understand now that we are in stage 5 of 7, if you see that the timeline points to collapse between 2034 and 2050, then subscribe, because the next video will show you the 3-asset class framework that survives currency collapse. Which assets the Dutch who survived held in 1795? Which assets the British who survived held in 1949? Which assets Americans must hold before the dollar loses reserve status? The 7 stages tell you what happens. The 3-asset framework tells you how to survive it. The only question is whether you will reposition before the dollar falls below 50% of global reserves, or whether you will wish you had after stage 6 makes repositioning impossible.